probably could be argued that we should stop with Herod the Great as the last of the important figures in the political spectrum of the period between the Testaments. And the arguments behind that would probably be valid. If you remember back on your chart that we're really not using that much anymore, he's the last figure that's mentioned on there. Last important figure. A few high priests come along at the end of his life, but he's the last important figure that's mentioned there. So it could be argued that we should stop with Herod the Great. We're not going to, however, because he founded the Herodian dynasty, the Herodian line of kings. And I've said earlier that's why he's most important as far as we're concerned. Not because of his manner of life, which was certainly amoral from beginning to end, even as it related to Matthew chapter 2 and the so-called slaughter of the innocents, and not because of his building projects would he be the most important as far as we're concerned. He's most important because he founded the Herodian line of kings. So many times in the Gospels we're seeing references to various Herods, to Archelaus, to Philip. Later on we see some other Herods in the book of Acts by the name of Agrippa, Agrippa the First and Agrippa the Second. All of this has a lot to do with Herod the Great. And since I'm quite sure that no one here could properly distinguish between each one of these figures, that just the name Herod appears time and time again, I think we'll take the time to go through, maybe half of the 1st century A.D., and wrap up a study of Herod by looking at his sons. In his will, he stipulated the division of his kingdom between 3 of his sons. And we're going to look in order at these: Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. The 3 sons of Herod, among whom, according to the stipulation of his will, after his death, his kingdom was to be divided. Archelaus was to be made Ethnarch of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Herod Antipas was to be made Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. And the other son, least important as far as we're concerned, Philip, was to be made Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. All of that according to the teaching that we can find right in the Gospels, as a matter of fact. We are going to begin then looking at Archelaus. The second of these sons, Antipas, is the most important of the sons. He's the most important not only from our perspective and our point of view, but he's most important as far as the Herodian dynasty, these 3 immediate sons, would be concerned. He's most important as far as the study of the Gospels is concerned because he appears more often. Archelaus is only going to appear really by name once, and Philip is not that important. It will be the middle of these, Herod Antipas, that fox, as Jesus referred to him over in Luke's Gospel. That fox will be the most important one. But we'll look at the one of the 3 who was to be made Ethnarch, Archelaus of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Now, I'm going to show you on the overhead here where these territories are, so you can get a little familiar with these 3 men and the territory we're talking about. Idumea is right off the map down here. You know where that is, the southern part, wherever the Edomites were. Here you can see it. Idumea, Judea, Samaria. That covers basically all of Israel with the exception of Galilee. Here we're talking about Archelaus. He's the son that we're going to be looking at this morning. Then Herod Antipas was to be made not Ethnarch, but Tetrarch of Galilee and of Perea, where we know probably most of Jesus' ministry took place. Only on several occasions, probably feast occasions, festival occasions, did Jesus actually go down to Jerusalem. Of course, some of his ministry takes place there. We learn most of that from John's Gospel. And the Synoptic Gospels place most of his ministry either up here in Galilee or over here in Perea, where there was supposed to be the so-called Bethany beyond Jordan. And then you have the other son, Philip, who was to control this area, Trachonitis, you see that? And this area, Iturea, which I would probably place, can you lower this a little, see what's up here at the top? Here's Abilene, and we'll get to Lysanias, who was a tetrarch of Abilene, but he's not related to these three sons. I would probably put this territory, Iturea, up this little section. So we're talking about up north of, this is Mount Hermon. We're talking about up way north of the Sea of Galilee, Paneas, which later was known as Caesarea Philippi. Now, you're probably not that familiar with some of these territories, such as Iturea, Trachonitis, and Perea. That would be my guess, that people would be not that familiar with them. You're familiar with Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. I can hardly overemphasize how important this is to keep this straight in your mind, and how important these next few studies will be concerning Herod's sons, because you find them in the narratives of John Baptist and in the narratives of Jesus time and time and time again, particularly Herod Antipas, time and time and time again in the gospel accounts. And of course, my contention is, too many people, too often, confuse, and if they don't confuse, they don't know anything about all of these names that appear there. They keep seeing Herod. And if you had just ended with a teaching on Herod the Great, they would just kind of assume this is the same man found time and time again, which is not true at all. A lot of people don't realize we haven't done a whole lot of in-depth New Testament studies, and you're probably not that familiar with the itineraries of the gospel, with New Testament terminology and travel. Therefore, my guess would be a lot of people aren't familiar with Perea. But Perea is very important as far as Jesus' ministry in the Gospels is concerned. He's crossing over Jordan, and then he's coming back over Jordan. And he's crossing over Jordan, and he's coming back over Jordan. A lot of times whenever he's in Galilee, for instance, and he's wanting to visit Judea, for instance, he's not going to go through Samaria. I mean, he does on a few occasions. On one occasion, we find out that he said that he crossed on the border between Galilee and Samaria, which must have meant, there was probably a road that officially separated Samaria from Galilee. He would have come down from Galilee, and instead of going all the way across Samaria down to Judea, Samaritans live here, half-bred Jews. He would get on this road going toward the east, over across Jordan, down into Perea, bypassing Samaria the whole time, recross Jordan down here and go over through Jericho, through Bethany, through Bethphage, up to Jerusalem. Cross the Mount of Olives, up to Jerusalem. This territory, Trachonitis, is not that important, except it is mentioned in the New Testament over in Luke chapter 3, first 3 verses. We'll look at that later on. Iturea is not that important, which we would place up here in what's called Anti-Lebanon, on the other side of the Lebanon range. This is Mount Lebanon. It's not one mountain, though. The whole range of mountains here that separate interior Syria from the coastland, the plains of Tyre and Sidon on the Mediterranean. These other places, I see a few other names spelled on here. I think we'll come to those later when we get a little more specific. We will come to Abilene a little bit later. The Decapolis, you see this spelling here, the Decapolis, this is all of the confines here in red. It actually crosses over into Samaria. It was a confederation of 10 Greek cities, one of these being all the way down here, Ascalon, which, as you notice here, and as they say, is a free city. It was not part of the province of Judea or Samaria, Galilee, or Palestine. It was part of the Decapolis here. You've got 9 cities here in Ascalon. One of the old Palestine, or the Philistine cities, was another. That's important. That's mentioned, end of Matthew 4, if I remember correctly. That is mentioned, the Decapolis in the New Testament. This territory, Jesus had something to do with it, but it might have been in this narrow bottleneck territory as he came from Galilee, bypassing Samaria, across Jordan, down to Perea, recross Jordan, go through Jericho, Bethany, Mount of Olives, and then Jerusalem. So Archelaus. Archelaus then, I guess, would appear to be the most important. As far as the Jews are concerned, he would be the most important because he was made ethnarch of this territory here of Judea, which is where their capital of Jerusalem is. Samaria from the north to the south, Judea, and where the Edomites lived in Idumea. Okay, let's start with Archelaus this morning and begin looking at a lot of information, a lot of interesting information that will get you oriented geographically in your mind as to who these men are and as to where their territories were. Archelaus made ethnarch of Judea, of Samaria, of Idumea. The will of Herod stipulated that his territory would be divided not equally, but divided among these three sons. But for final approval of Herod's will, all three sons had to travel to Rome to present their case before Caesar Augustus. If the will was validated and confirmed by the Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar, then they would be allowed to return home and take up rule in these separate territories. Now the Jews were, as I said, chiefly concerned with Archelaus because he controlled Judea, which is where their capital city of Jerusalem was. And as a result of them being so concerned about who the next ruler is going to be, in other words, they have not had the best of rulers. They've had a good political ruler, but not the best as far as the murders that were committed, in having Herod the Great. And Archelaus follows in some regards in the steps of his father. And so since they are a little concerned, they send a delegation of 50 men picked out from Judea to Rome, asking that the Romans come and rule over them directly instead of ruling through an Edomite, an Idumean. If you'll turn over to Luke 19, Jesus gives a parable concerning the kingdom of God, concerning his absence and his return in the second advent. And there's general agreement that he's taking as a backdrop or as background material the trip of Archelaus to Rome and the trip of others behind him trying to thwart his coming to rule. Luke 19, verse 11. We're through with this up here. And as they heard these things, he added and spake a parable, because he was nigh to Jerusalem, and because they thought that the kingdom of God should immediately appear. He said, therefore, a certain nobleman, watch this scenario that unfolds, went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. That's a direct portrayal of the trip of Archelaus. He's going to use that. He's using figures of speech, stories as background or backdrop material in Palestine because the Jews are familiar with this. And if he started telling the Jews a story about a certain nobleman who went into a far country to receive a kingdom for himself and then to return, they would know right away what type of connection he's making here. And of course they know as the connection goes on that others were sent after him to say, no, we don't want him. And of course he's going to draw a parallel from that about his situation as far as Judaism is concerned. Now you see, verse 12 would be pretty much unintelligible otherwise. A certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom. Well, where's the kingdom that you're going to receive? Why would you go into a far country to get a kingdom and not stay there? Because the rest of the verse says, and return. So it looks like you have your kingdom where you are geographically. You have to go somewhere else to have it legally validated, and then you're going to return and take over officially your kingdom. And he called his 10 servants and delivered them 10 pounds and said unto them, occupy till I come. He had to leave some people behind, of course, to make sure everything stays at least status quo until his return. But his citizens hated him, those that were part of this territory that he was going to receive officially, and sent a message after him saying, we will not have this man reign over us. And that, according to Josephus, is precisely what took place with the initiation of the reign of Archelaus. A delegation of 50 important elders of the Jewish nation were sent, citizens of this kingdom, and said, we will not have Archelaus to reign over us. Of course, he's not telling the whole story here, because he's not trying to tell a history lesson about Archelaus, but make an analogy, make a parallel from that. Because he could go on and say other things about Archelaus and say other things about what the Jewish delegation had to say, such as, we will not have this man to reign over us, but you Romans come and reign over us directly. It came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. It seems like verse 14 pretty much drops the notion of a parallel between him and Archelaus. It would be just verses 12, 13, and 14. Then, of course, he's going to use that as a springboard. And he goes on to say, now, give an account of your 10 pounds, your 5 pounds, and your 1. And you know how the parable ends up. But the first 3 verses, I would say, 12, 13, and 14, seem to be intelligible only on the basis of an understanding of Archelaus and the delegation of Jewish men that were sent. Well, what happened whenever he got and they arrived at Rome is that Augustus Caesar turned the Jews down, thus confirming, legally validating the will of Herod, stipulating that his kingdom be divided among his 3 sons. Now, I said that Archelaus was made Ethnarch of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. What exactly does that title mean? Well, that brings us into a discussion of several titles, and this is probably the best place to do it since we're going to be throwing these titles around for the next few weeks. We need to know something of what we speak. Let's take a look at different titles that we will be using, that are used in the Bible, that are used by Josephus to distinguish these certain men. We'll start with the title king, since that, and we'll work our way down the scale. King would rank up at the very top. We could say emperor would rank above that, but it seems like in 1 Peter, king is used as emperor, so we'll leave it as king, since that's the popular term. Now, one thing you'll find with the title king, and I think you'll find this with most of the titles, is that the meanings are often blurred because they're used loosely. Originally, they had a very concrete, very definite, very specific, and therefore non-loose meaning. As time passes, as different people, such as the Romans, incorporate some Greek terminology, they don't use them in the specific technical sense as maybe the Greeks or someone else would have earlier. And so you have to be familiar with this because, in other words, we'll come across some of these sons of Herods who, if they were anything, they were not a king, and they'll be referred to as a king. And that cannot be used, as some of the critical scholars will say. You see, as soon as you find one of these little so-called mistakes here, then they blow it out of proportion. Well, Matthew or Mark refers to this man as a king. Luke doesn't. Luke's really technical in the language that he uses, but Matthew or Mark refers to him as a king, and we know that he wasn't. He was an ethnarch, he was a tetrarch, he was a governor, he was a prefect, he was a legate, he was a proconsul, he was a procurator, but a king? He was certainly not a king. Well, he's using it in the loose sense of the term. I mean, I don't guess, would refer to our president as a king, but in sense, that's what he is. If you did refer to him as king, we wouldn't say, an anachronism here. You're talking about Great Britain back in the Revolutionary days when you're speaking of kingship or something. No, we'd know that means kind of the supreme leader in this country or in a certain area. We don't have to officially call him president. We could refer to him as king. The New Testament, it's used, this title king is used of Herod the Great, which is technically and officially correct. Matthew 2:1 and Luke 1:5. Now that is technically correct. Remember that he was given the kingship in 40 BC and put it into action in 37 by taking Jerusalem, his kingdom. So this is technically correct. Matthew 2:1, Luke 1:5, Herod the Great was a king. Title is also used for Antipas, Antipas, second of Herod's sons that we've mentioned. It's also used of Antipas in Matthew 14:9 and Luke 6, or Mark rather, 6:14. Now it's not used by Luke. Maybe you'll remember from our studies in the book of Acts that Luke was a medical doctor. He was trained scientifically. Medical doctors are at least supposed to be, and it generally works this way. They're extremely organized people. You have all types of facts and figures to put in various slots, various symptoms that are supposed to manifest the existence of a certain disease, and all of this has to be categorized in your mind. Luke has that type of mind. We're not saying Matthew or Mark or John would be dumb, considered dumb or illiterate. They couldn't have written their Gospels. But he's very organized. And in the writing of the book of Acts, the titles and the terms that you'll see Luke employing are extremely correct. And that's been one proof text, one way of proving critical scholarship wrong and saying, well, these guys don't know what they're talking about. They're giving us second, third, fourth, fifth-hand reports, and they're not trustworthy. Whenever Luke gives a discussion of a certain ruler, he will give the ruler most of the time, more times than not, as a matter of fact. He'll give him only by his official term. This is not true in Matthew or Mark, probably because we see their personality coming through. They are not that type of thinker, as was the gospel writer Luke. So in Matthew 14:9, and the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. It, the head of John Baptist, her to his wife through his daughter, through her daughter, not really his, but through hers and another man's. Matthew 14:9. And then Mark 6:14, a parallel account. Notice in both places, Antipas, this happens to be Antipas, is referred to as a king. Technically, that's a mistake. But if you're using it in a loose sense, then you just mean ruler, leader, supreme ruler or leader in this territory, Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. And King Herod heard of him. Now look there in Mark 6:14. If you don't know anything about the Herods, then you see King Herod and you just think of King Herod, the only one, King Herod the Great. But this is one of his three sons here, second one that we're concerned about. King Herod heard of him, for his name was spread abroad. He said that John the Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Well, we're talking about Herod Antipas, who was a tetrarch. Archelaus was an ethnarch. Philip was a tetrarch. Pontius Pilate was a prefect. They all go by various technical titles and distinctions, but none of these should be referred to as a king. Then over in Acts chapters 25 through 27, we just have three whole chapters here. Agrippa is referred to as king, and he also was not a king. What he was will be to him later. There are a couple of Agrippas here, and we'll have to look at both of these. But for instance, if you look over in chapter 26 and verse 27, and that's just found throughout these three chapters here. But here's a verse that's familiar. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Paul's saying that. You could go back to 25:24. And Festus said, King Agrippa. So if Paul's wrong, so is Festus then. They like to make, any Christians wrong, that they are the ones who make the mistakes. Well, Festus says, King Agrippa, all men which are present with us, we see this man Paul. And it's just on and on through this chapter. In the 26th verse, it ends, O King Agrippa, that after examination, then I'll have somewhat to write back to Rome about this man. He wants Agrippa's expertise on religious affairs here because Festus doesn't know much of what's going on. He's got to write a letter back to Rome. He doesn't know what to put in it. They're talking about resurrection. They talk about a God resurrection, a God Jesus who was dead and then rose from the dead. He said, I don't know what's going on here. So let me talk to Agrippa. Agrippa had Jewish connections, and so he knew something about Jewish way of life. That's why Paul asked him. You see, all of this will make sense when we get to it later on. That's why Paul didn't ask Festus this question. He asked Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Agrippa had been brought up around the teaching of the prophets, and Festus hasn't. So you have to know that, or you say, well, what's going on here? King Agrippa, now is he one of Herod's sons, and now he's king in Jerusalem? No, it doesn't work out like that at all. That's why I began saying I doubt anyone here could properly distinguish between all of these names, these different men, and how they are related. And I even have, did I bring? Well, I wasn't supposed to bring them. It doesn't look like I did. I don't even have my copy, but I have a whole genealogy that I've worked up for you, and I had the printer run it all for us, so it will keep things a little more straight in your mind. We'll be looking at that later on. As soon as it starts getting confusing, we'll look at that. Shouldn't be that way yet now, because I'm talking about future messages. We're still just dealing with Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. So Agrippa, we see Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa, referred to as king, and finally Aretas the Fourth is referred to as king. Now he's one that doesn't even concern what we're talking about, but we have to cover him since the title king is placed with him. 2 Corinthians 11:32. Aretas is mentioned as a king. That may be closer to being officially correct than would be the designation of Herod Antipas or Agrippa as king of anything. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas the king. Now this is Aretas the Fourth, Aretas or Aretas the Fourth. We've already discussed Aretas or Aretas the Third before. That was way back a couple of hundred years prior to this. But Aretas the Fourth. We will discuss him later, how he enters the picture because of his daughter marrying into a certain family of people. But we'll be to that later. And then finally here under the title king, we're just giving you everyone that's referred to, outside of Jesus, of course, just political leaders here, not spiritual ones, everyone that's referred to as a king in the New Testament. Over in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 and 17. Now we have no name here, but the reference could well be taken as one to the Roman emperor. I don't think it could be taken referring to anyone in Palestine, because, of course, Peter's not writing to anyone in Palestine, but up into Asia Minor. And to these people in these various provinces in Asia Minor, we don't have kings ruling over them, 1 Peter 1:1. We don't have kings ruling over them. Therefore, it seems to be rather likely that we would take these verses, 2, 13, and 17, chapter 2, verses 13 and 17, as probably a reference to the current Roman ruler, which was who at this time? Who was a Roman ruler, Roman emperor? Nero. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king. Now, officially, the Roman leaders were referred to as emperors, not as kings. But again, we're probably to take this in the loose sense of the term. He means the overall ruler. And we definitely get this overall sense by the next phrase as well as the next verse. He's working his way down the scale here, whether it be to the king as supreme. So that doesn't mean a tetrarch or an ethnarch or a governor. It means whoever is the supreme ruler, which is the king. And then underneath that, or unto governors, those that work underneath the kings, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do well. And then verse 17, honor the king. 1 Peter 2, 13 and 17, honor the king, probably a reference we should take to Nero. Of course, you can apply that in principle form to any governmental official. But it seems as though he's speaking of the highest of governmental officials, that being the Roman emperor, he being Nero at this time. So this is the highest distinction that one could have, king or emperor, king. This would be the highest of the titles. Secondly, ethnarch, E-T-H-N-A-R-C-H, ethnarch. Now the Greek word is used only once in the New Testament that's behind this term, and that's back in 2 Corinthians 11:32. It's been translated here governor, but it's a technical term that means an ethnarch. In Damascus, the ethnarch, the governor, under Aretas the king, kept the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desirous to apprehend me, the Apostle Paul says. But we're going to find that with this governor business, it's just like with the kingship business. Different words, many different words, are thrown back and forth in a loose sense. Therefore, I don't think we would have to write in here ethnarch, although that is the word behind it, because it's not used in its early technical sense as it originally was. What the word basically means is a governor of an ethnic group of people. In other words, you wouldn't be controlling several territories if we have a different ethnic group of people there. We have all Jews or Samaritans that are related to the Jews, then we could have an ethnarch over them. You could have a tetrarch as well, but Archelaus happens to be known in Josephus' writings as an ethnarch. It is a position just below the rank of king. In Josephus' Antiquities, 1711-4, we have our reference of Archelaus as ethnarch of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Josephus' Antiquities, 1711-4. Now, while we're here under ethnarch, let's look at another term in the English sense that appears so many times, and that's governor, which is what we find here in 2 Corinthians 11:32. Governor is used to translate about 10 different Hebrew terms and about 7 different Greek words. So it's kind of a catch-all. Governor is used to translate about 10 different Hebrew terms and 7 different Greek words. But almost all of it, if not all of it, is in a lax, loose, non-technical sense, which therefore is okay. In other words, we can't just think because we are talking of 10 different Hebrew words, we have to end up with 10 different English words to match those. Not necessarily true at all. 7 Greek words, 7 English to match those. Not necessarily there at all either. But governor just means ruler, a ruler of a group of people. Ethnarch gives us the ethnic connotation to it. Chiefly in the New Testament, governor in the KJV is used of Pilate, Felix, and Festus, none of whom were governors. But I guess in a loose sense we can speak of them as governors, as rulers. So it's primarily used of 3 prefects or procurators, Pilate, Felix, and Festus. Now, understand what we're doing here. This is going to be a little technical, as so many of these teachings have been. But it will just open up to your understanding all of these various rulers in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. Who they are, where they ruled, what they were like, what they did. We've already given you there Luke 19, verses 11 through 14. It helps you better understand a spiritual teaching there, a parable of Christ about the kingdom. To understand that he's using as a backdrop Archelaus and the delegation of 50 Jewish men going to Rome. Pilate, Felix, and Festus many times are spoken of as governors. Felix the governor, Festus the governor, Pilate the governor, came to Jerusalem or came to the feast. Well, they really weren't governors, but it's okay to translate it that way. So we have king, second in rank is ethnarch or governor. A third term is tetrarch. Antipas and Philip, the 2 other sons of Herod, were both appointed as tetrarchs. Just like it sounds, T-E-T-R, Tetrarch, tetrarch. Tetrarch was a Macedonian term from Philip, father of Alexander the Great. Back in the days when Philip divided Thessaly, a province of which Macedonia was a city, or a general region, we could say, divided Thessaly into 4 tetrarchies. So a tetrarch, it only makes sense, would rule a tetrarchy. A satrap rules a satrapy. That's Persian terminology, though. That's back in Esther. Tetra, what's that mean? How many numbers are we talking about? before. Originally, and therefore technically, it meant the ruler of 1/4 of a kingdom. Obviously, that's what it had to originally mean, or there'd be no sense in calling him a tetra anything. Tetra means 4. So either you rule 4 kingdoms or 1/4 of a kingdom. You could take it one or of those two ways. And 4 kingdoms would probably be a world emperor king. 1/4 of a kingdom, 1/4 of the kingdom belonging to a king or emperor would be a tetrarchy ruled by a tetrarch. So it's a Greek term. Basically these terms are Greek. Now we'll get to some Latin ones here in a moment, but ethnarch and tetrarch come from Greek usage. In Roman times, it's used more loosely, obviously, just like is ethnarch or governor. It's used more loosely for a ruler of any province. So even though I could say this, even though, for instance, we have a certain ethnic group of people in X province, just because that's true, we won't necessarily have an ethnarch over them. We might have a tetrarch over them. Even though that province in which they live and over which he rules is not necessarily the 4th part of the division of some larger kingdom. It meant that originally, but not by this time. Who are tetrarchs? Well, Antipas, we've already said, was a tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Philip was a tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. And it just so happens, probably more by coincidence than a technical Greek usage though, that both Antipas and Philip did receive 1/4 of Herod's kingdom. Just so happens this worked out. We've got 3 sons. How can we divide a territory in 4 parts with only 3 sons? End up with 4 parts. Well, Antipas gets 1/4 of it. That makes him a tetrarch. Philip gets 1/4 of it. That makes him a tetrarch. Archelaus gets 1/2 of it. That makes him an ethnarch. A quarter and a half equal the whole of Herod's kingdom. Now, my suggestion is this is just pure coincidence that it happened this way. Because we know by this time, and especially among the Romans when this term is used, it's not used as it was back in the 4th century BC with Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. Otherwise you'd say, well, that happened exactly right. Antipas and Philip both got a 1/4 of the part of the kingdom of Herod that makes them a tetrarch. Just so happened that it worked out that way, that Archelaus got what we could approximate as 1/2 of the kingdom, and Herod Antipas and Herod Philip only received 1/4. More by chance, coincidence, accident than anything else so. Okay, let's look up a couple of references here for these men under the tetrarchies then. First of all, let's deal with Antipas. We have him in Matthew 14:1. We'll take the time to look these up. You'll see the context. Matthew 14:1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus. He's called Herod the Tetrarch. So if you know which Herod is a tetrarch and which is an ethnarch, then you'll know which Herod he's talking about. He's talking about Herod Antipas here. At that time, Herod, but notice he's not called Antipas. He's never called Antipas, by the way. He's just called Herod. And that's our problem. Too many Herods in the Bible. Too confusing. At that time, Antipas, the tetrarch, heard of the fame of Jesus. Then we have him in Luke 3:1. We're not going to look at that just yet. Same chapter, Luke 3:19. Luke 3:19. But Herod the Tetrarch, being reproved by him for Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, and for all the evils which Herod had done. Now look at all these names we have. Herod, who is a tetrarch, was reproved by John Baptist for Herodias. There's another Herod for you, just of feminine form. Herodias, his brother Philip's. Now we know he's got a brother named Philip, right? who is tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. But is this the same brother, or does he have two brothers named Philip? His brother, or is this just a half-brother? Philip's wife, and for all the evils which Herod had done. So it's a little amusing that it gets a little confusing. Then over in chapter 9 and verse 7, now Herod the Tetrarch, some people call it a tetrarch, that's the way it's drawn out for us in the KJV, long E, a tetrarch. I think tetrarch's a better pronunciation. Tetrarch and tetrarchies. Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, and he was perplexed because that it was said of some that John had risen from the dead. And then over in Acts 13:1, probably we have a reference to the same man here. Acts, way over in Acts, chapter 13 and verse 1. So when you see these titles now, as you read through the Gospels of Tetrarch, you just remember that originally it meant the ruler of a fourth part of a kingdom. And by the time of the New Testament, the technical meaning has passed off the scene, and it just means, in general, a ruler of some province. Now, there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers. Starts with Barnabas down to the end, Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So he's looking back in retrospect, in other words, on the life of Antipas here, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. So in other words, we have as a prophet and or a teacher in the church at Antioch a man who as a boy had been raised with Herod, Antipas, been raised in his vicinity and were boyhood chums or friends or something. So that's just an interesting historical note in itself. Then we have only one reference to Philip, which gives away something I just alluded to earlier, and that's over in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Now remember, they could be spoken of, both of these men, Antipas and Philip, they could be spoken of loosely as king, Matthew 14:9, Mark 6:14. But we're looking in Luke here, Luke 3:1, and Luke always maintains the technically correct term, as I've explained earlier. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, now that was our discussion last time. What was the first year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar? When did he begin to reign? 14, so you can start dating that. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Augustus Caesar now has passed off the scene. Pontius Pilate being governor. Remember I said earlier that generally governor is used of Pilate, Felix, and Festus. And here's one of those many, many places. Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea. Who actually is this man, Pontius Pilate? We know him from Passion Plays, but who is Pontius Pilate? Herod being, look at this, Tetrarch of Galilee. We know him as Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. He governed because whoever controlled Galilee also controlled Perea. Both of those are on the fringe of the Jewish state anyway. Well, you see, you wouldn't know what's going on here. Now we know he's talking about the second son of Herod, Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, being Tetrarch of Galilee. His brother Philip, another son of Herod the Great, Tetrarch of Iturea and of the region of Trachonitis. See, I wasn't speaking in tongues whenever I gave you those terms earlier. There it is. And I didn't make up those terms. There they are right in your Bible. And then we'll just kind of add on here with our look at tetrarchs and tetrarchies. Lysanias, the Tetrarch of Abilene. Now here it's probably used more loosely than with Antipas and Philip. Lysanias was not a tetrarch, did not control any extent of territory that would approximate the extent of territory controlled by Antipas and Philip. But since they are used, since they are referred to in a loose sense, and it doesn't bother us that Lysanias is referred to as well. I mean, he is referred to in other places as a tetrarch, but he controls such a small territory. that that would give some people, I guess, problems in looking at Luke chapter 3 and verse 1.
For the continuation of this method,
He is referred to in other places as a tetrarch, but he controls such a small territory that that would give some people, I guess, problems in looking at Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Now that's a political dating of the ministry of John the Baptist. In verse 2, he goes on to give us a religious dating, Annas and Caiaphas being the high priests. The word of God came unto John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. So you can see he gives us a political dating, first of all, in his chronological system here. And you wouldn't know what date he's talking about unless you know a lot about these men involved. And even when he just says Pontius Pilate being governor, he doesn't tell us what year he's talking about as governor. So that's why he starts off in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. That gives us our date right away. Then he goes on just saying Pontius Pilate governor, Herod tetrarch, his brother Philip tetrarch, another person Lysanias tetrarch, Annas Caiaphas high priest, then John the Baptist came as this voice crying in the wilderness. Okay, a fourth term is procurator. Procurator. Now we're getting into Latin terms here. The procurators were men taken from the second rank of Roman society, which was referred to as the equestrian order. It has its origin, of course, with their riding horses. They were taken from the second rank of Roman society, which was the equestrian order. You ever heard of the term equestrian before? Okay. Original connection with horsemanship. They were responsible for military and financial administration of the far-flung Roman imperial provinces. Military financial administrators of imperial provinces. They were allowed to have on hand an auxiliary of troops, sometimes spoken of as a Roman garrison in the KJV. We're only concerned primarily with those of Palestine, so Caesarea was the seat of government for the procurator. Caesarea on the Mediterranean. Caesarea, remember, was the city built by Herod the Great, built the fortress there for himself, the palace, dug the harbor, the stadiums, all the housing, all the buildings there in Caesarea on the Mediterranean. Therefore, any procurator was not stationed at Jerusalem, but rather at Caesarea. That's very important to know. A lot of people don't know that, don't have any idea what's going on in that area. He is never stationed at Jerusalem. That's the religious capital of Palestine. Roman capital of Palestine is Caesarea. Not Jerusalem, it's Caesarea. So you have to keep in your mind the fact we're talking about dual capitals then, one from a Jewish point of view and one from a Roman point of view. From the Roman point of view, Caesarea with its great, magnificent harbor, now having been built by Herod, easy access by means of ship to Rome, to Italy, was taken as the capital of the country. Now there is much debate. You can either go on and add number 5, I guess you should, so you've got it broken down, add prefect, and or you can keep it under procurator. There's much debate as to whether this term procurator was used all along or whether it followed the earlier term prefect. A lot of scholarly debate over that. So we'll give our opinion. Seems to be proven now in recent archaeological discoveries, but we'll give our opinion concerning the connection, the chronological order of these terms, procurator and prefect. Tacitus, the Roman historian, refers to Pontius Pilate as a procurator. I'll give you the lines of evidence. There's really one point of evidence in favor of both positions. One that says procurator was the technical distinction used prior to prefect, and the other that prefect was used prior to procurator. We're asking ourselves the question, which of these came first? Did prefect come before procurator or vice versa? Tacitus tells us that Pontius Pilate was a procurator. Pontius Pilate ruled 2636 AD, so that puts it way back to the first half of the first century. We know that prefect is used after this time, but since we have a Roman historian from the first century referring to Pontius Pilate in the first half of that century as a procurator, that would tend to conclude that procurator antedates prefect. However, there's a new line of evidence to the contrary. An inscription that was found in the recent archaeological excavation of Caesarea that we discussed whenever we looked at Herod's architectural work. In 1961, uncovered a stone slab which had the following inscription: Pilate, prefect of Judea. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, which obviously dates right back to the very time of Pontius Pilate himself. I have a picture of that. I'll show that to you later when we come to Pontius Pilate. Now, we have to ask ourselves the question, whom are we going to believe? Tacitus, or the man who chiseled and then the man who discovered this inscription? Well, it's hard to disbelieve Tacitus because he's writing as a Roman historian right during the first century. But I guess it's more difficult to disbelieve a stone that cannot lie. Tacitus could be confused about something. Tacitus did write after the time of Pontius Pilate by many years. That stone had to have been carved during the time of Pontius Pilate. That point, along with a second point, that Tacitus has been found on other occasions to be mistaken in his designations of Roman rulers in the first century, then tend for me to conclude, and other scholars to conclude, that prefect was the official technical title that came first, and that was followed by procurator. So that's what we're going to adopt then. Tacitus does refer to Pontius Pilate as a procurator. The inscriptions, however, which seem to antedate Tacitus and his information, refer to Pontius Pilate as a prefect. Now, both of these are Latin terms, both procurator and prefect. Again, they're just general terms that mean a ruler of a province or territory. Say, well, what about the Greek? Well, the Greek word behind some of the terms that are used in the New Testament could be synonymous of either one of these, since procurator and prefect mean the same thing. They don't mean anything different. A procurator and a prefect are the same thing. It's just that chronologically we have to put prefect before procurator. Okay, then if you're on number 6 or number 5, whatever you're on, then we'll come to a legate. Legate. A legate. Now, this does not appear in the New Testament, but it will appear in our studies many times, so we're going to go ahead and just discuss it briefly. It's another technical Latin term that referred to the Roman governor of a senatorial province. A prefect was the financial, political administrator of an imperial province. Therefore, the difference between the two is only a difference of the status of the province over which they rule. They both would function as financial, political administrators. This, of course, later will bring up the whole subject of taxation in the New Testament. That will be an important subject we'll look at later. They are financial political administrators, so it has to do something with finances in. Syria at this time was controlled, it appears, by a legate, and therefore was thought of as a senatorial province and not an imperial one. That's debatable. We will debate that and discuss that later on whenever we look at the various provinces. Which ones are senatorial and how many exist in this time as senatorial, and which ones are imperial and how many exist. Which would be Judea? Well, I think we've pretty much answered that. If it's controlled by a prefect, it'd be an imperial province then, as opposed to a legate controlling Syria, which makes it a senatorial province. In other words, one is controlled by the Roman Senate, which still, and it still has a vestigial existence to it at this time, and the other would be by the Roman emperor himself, Tiberius, or if we go earlier, to Augustus Caesar. One other official title, 6 or 7, a proconsul. This will cover all the ones that we really need to be familiar with. King, ethnarch, tetrarch, procurator, prefect, legate, proconsul. 2 of these are mentioned in the New Testament, 2 proconsuls. Both of them are outside of Palestine. Therefore, it's not that important for us to study, but we will look them up. The KJV mistranslates both as deputies. They had deputies in England, the 17th century, but not deputies back in Asia Minor. Sergius Paulus was proconsul of Cyprus, Acts 13:7, and Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, Acts 18:12, and Luke correctly gives us proconsul. He gives us the technical term for these 2 men. Let's look these up. Acts 13:7. Cyprus, remember, is that island to which Paul first traveled on his first journey. Landed at the eastern end, went all the way across, traversing it to the western end, and then sailed to the northwest. When they had gone through the isle unto Paphos, they found a certain sorcerer, a false prophet, a Jew, whose name was Bar-Jesus, which was the proconsul of the country. Not deputy. Luke gives us the technical terms. That's what we need to leave here since he gave it to us. Which was the proconsul of the country, Sergius Paulus, a prudent man who called for Barnabas and Saul and desired to hear the word of God. And then in Acts 18 and verse 12, so that tells us who is controlling Cyprus here. Not a legate, not a prefect, but a proconsul. Here in verse 12 of the 18th chapter of the same book, Gallio is referred to as a proconsul of Achaia, southern portion of the Greek mainland. But when Gallio was the proconsul, not deputy, just an English term, but the proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. Gallio was related to Seneca, so he's an important man. Seneca was more important, but he's an important man, and it's interesting that Luke does refer to him and does refer to him correctly as a proconsul. And there's one other place I want to look at. No one appears by name here, but Acts chapter 19 and verse 38. I said that we only have 2 proconsuls mentioned, but we have the term proconsul appearing 3 times. Here it's just given to us in general. Acts 19. Remember, all the people have caused almost a riot in the city because they think that Paul is going to do something to their business of worshiping these pagan gods and goddesses. Verse 37, ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches or temples, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore if Demetrius, who evidently was the founding father of the local 474 union of shrine makers, Demetrius the craftsman, which are with him, if they have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are proconsuls. Let them implead one another. So, this, as well as particularly the case in Acts chapter 18 and verse 12, inform us that They acted almost as judges. Proconsuls acted in a judicial capacity, not so much in the capacity of an administrator, but a judicial capacity. Bring your case before him. The courts are open. The law is open. We have proconsuls. Bring your case before them and let them decide. Now, boy, we're running out of time. I don't know how much detail I want to go into this. I forgot about this. I'll just mention the problem here. We don't exactly know the solution, but there's one of two solutions here. Luke, referring to proconsul in the plural, seems to be out of sync with the way you generally refer to a proconsul. In other words, if we're talking about a particular city, a particular area, of course we're at Ephesus here, there can only be one proconsul there. You can't have more than one. You certainly can't have a plurality of proconsuls in the same city. So why does Luke give it to us in the plural, proconsuls? Well, there have been two suggestions. One, the most obvious, that wouldn't take any background understanding or information or knowledge, would be just using it in a loose sense. He just says, there are people you can take this to. He doesn't mean that there are a plurality of people right there, right now in Ephesus, a plurality of proconsuls. He just means there are proconsuls. Proconsuls exist in the Roman Empire for this purpose, to bring your case before them. That's one way we could take him using this. A second way would be, if we can date this chapter, and it appears to be true that we can, to the date that we think we can date this very episode happening here at Ephesus, we know that there were no proconsuls at this time in Ephesus because there was a change. One had just left the office, and the other was just to be officially brought into the office. And therefore, Luke is so correct. This might be stretching it too far, but I don't think that it is. He's so correct that he's taking into account the fact there are no proconsuls right now, but there was one day before yesterday, and there will be one day after tomorrow. Therefore, I'll speak of them in the plurality, proconsuls, because you just had one, we're just going to have one. That's how technical Luke is in his writing here. You don't know that, of course, just from reading Acts. You have to know some other historical material. So you could take one or the other, or maybe even both of those ways of explaining the plurality of proconsuls here in Acts 19:38. Now, who else is learning things like this on a Sunday morning? Of course, you might ask, who else cares about things like this on a Sunday morning, especially a beautiful one like this? So there are all the technical terms, and that seems to be the way we would interpret Acts 19:38. Okay, let's get back to Archelaus. I am going to finish him up as we finish up this morning. Now, how do we get off him? Because he's an ethnarch, and we had to describe what an ethnarch was, and then what a tetrarch was, and then a procurator, and then a prefect, and then a legate, and then a proconsul. So now we're through with all of the terms. We're going to be throwing those around all the time now, from now on, so you might want to accustom yourself to those terms and what they mean. Back to Archelaus the Ethnarch, a ruler of an ethnic group of people of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. He was confirmed in his position at Rome as the legitimate successor to his father as ethnarch in this threefold territory, and he returned to Israel. We could say that he's the worst of all of the sons of Herod. He had all of his father's bad traits. You know what those traits are: suspicion, intrigue, jealousy, murders, strife, domestic turmoil. He had all of his father's bad traits and very few of his good ones. He was shortchanged among the sons, I guess we could say. Good traits. We said Herod the Great was an architectural genius, and he was a political one as well. Archelaus doesn't have too much of this to speak of. Herod dies in 4 B.C. Jesus has been born. He's probably anywhere from a year to 2 years of age at the time of Herod's death. Since we're talking about Archelaus as ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, then maybe this could concern Jesus' life. Well, it would depend on the dates we give for the reign of Archelaus. We're going to give 4 B.C. to A.D. 6. 4 B.C. to A.D. 6, Archelaus as Ethnarch of Judea and Samaria. That means that this would cover the first 10 to 12 years of Jesus' life. For instance, if Jesus is born in 5 BC, Archelaus is banished in AD 6. That makes Jesus 11 years of age. Why are we saying that? Well, he came to Jerusalem when he was 12. So it would be a concern of ours who was in control of Jerusalem the time that Jesus came there as a young man at the age of 12. If our dating is correct, and there's no reason to believe these dates are not correct, then probably he just missed the reign of Archelaus by a year. Archelaus would have already been banished in AD 6. That would put Jesus in Jerusalem at the age of 12 in AD 7, 1 year after the banishment to Gaul of Archelaus. So that's interesting. I would like to know who would be the Roman ruler there. Archelaus married his brother's wife. Remember all of Herod's marriage problems. So it's just being picked up now by his sons. He married his brother's wife, which was a great offense to the Jews. A great offense not because he married his brother's wife, because that was commanded in the Old Testament under certain circumstances, that a brother who died was to have a brother who would marry his wife and raise up seed. Well, it was a great offense to them only because she had borne children to her first husband. And therefore, the so-called Jewish levirate law of marriage was not applicable. And because it was not applicable, then it was a great offense to the Jews for Archelaus to marry his brother's wife. If, you see, the woman bore children to the first brother, and that brother died, then it was, Jewishly speaking, it was illegal for your brother to marry this woman. Concerning building projects, he didn't have much to do. He did restore Jericho in the first place, which had been damaged in the revolt at his father's death. Remember, his father had done a lot to establish the new city of Jericho. There was a new Jericho and an old Jericho. And it was damaged in a revolt whenever Herod the Great died. And he also built a city 6 miles north of Jericho and named it after who else but himself. Now, Josephus accuses him of much and extreme wickedness, which is probably true. Shortly after Herod's death, remember how Herod knew no one would weep whenever he died, and so he wanted to kill some Jewish people just so there'd be tears shed in the land, even though they weren't for him. He could vicariously participate in it. Well, he was right in his thinking, whenever I die, if anything happens, there'll probably be parties. And there were. The Jews were excited, and they rose up and tried to storm the government. And so right after his father's death, at a Passover, there was a tremendous Jewish uprising, of course, at Jerusalem, and Archelaus slew 3,000 Jews in Jerusalem, which only lessened his prestige in the eyes of the Jewish people. He, just like his father, deposed high priests at will, which was supposed to be a sacred function. But he just did it for no reason but financial gain. Then, after a 10-year rule from 4 BC to AD 6, he was recalled to Rome. Why? A delegation of Jews and Samaritans. Rarely did those two groups band together, but with a common enemy, you pretty much have to. And he was ethnarch of both of their territories. A delegation of Jews and Samaritans had traveled to Rome, accusing him before the emperor, who of course was still Caesar Augustus at this time, of much wickedness and deceit. Now remember, a Jewish delegation had gone initially whenever he was to go and have the will confirmed, and Augustus listened to him and not to them. Now he listens to them and not to him. As a result of this delegation of Jews and Samaritans, in AD 6, Archelaus was banished to Gaul, sent into exile in Gaul. And beginning with this date, AD 6. Now we're going to come back to this later. This is fairly important here. Beginning with this date, prefects governed Judea. See, how did we say, if you can remember all of these technicalities thus far, we keep talking about earlier Pontius Pilate being a prefect or a procurator. And he was prefect, of course. We know he's down there in Jerusalem, the festival of the Passover and Jesus' Passion experience. We know now from this study that that couldn't have been where he resided, but rather up in Caesarea, since that was a Roman capital. So how do we end up with Pontius Pilate as a prefect whenever the ruler's Archelaus began as an ethnarch here? Well, it's because whenever he is banished, remember what the Jews in the first delegation had gone before Rome to say, you come and rule over us directly. Don't rule through an ethnarch or a tetrarch like this. Well, starting in AD 6, that's exactly what happens. The Romans do come to rule over them directly by appointing prefects. Later they become known as procurators. And Pontius Pilate, of course, is certainly not the first of those, but he's the most important because of his interplay with Jesus in his passion. So we start with an ethnarch, but whenever Archelaus is banished to Gaul in AD 6, then the procuratorship or the prefects take over after this time. That leaves us with only one passage at which to look, and that, of course, is Matthew chapter 2. Archelaus is only seen one time. Only seen one time in the New Testament. Herod Antipas, we looked at his places time and time again. Philip is seen only once over in Luke 3 and verse 1. Archelaus is seen only once, Matthew 2, verses 19 through 23. And we're going to kind of study this little passage briefly but carefully, because an interesting question is going to arise from this. Now we know from verses 1 through 18 we have Herod the Great as ruler. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeareth in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, who has his wife and the young child there with him, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life, meaning Herod and those around him. He arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. Now coming from Egypt, from the south, he would come into Judea, be around Jerusalem then. Notice verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus, the man we're talking about, did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Now, let me point out several things here. First of all, the verb reign in verse 22, R-E-I-G-N, comes from the word for king. So just pointing out another way in which king or ruling like a king is used in a loose sense. We know Archelaus not to be a king, but rather to be an ethnarch. But reign there could give some people a problem because it's a verb that comes from king. So when Joseph heard that Archelaus did reign in the loose sense as king, more technically as an ethnarch, according to Josephus' Antiquity 1711-4, in Judea, Archelaus in Judea. We know him, of course, in Samaria and in Idumea, but he's not concerned about Samaria, Idumea. He's only concerned about Judea here, so that's why this is mentioned alone. In the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. He would have been stationed at Jerusalem, contrary to later times when Roman leaders and rulers are stationed up at Caesarea. Notwithstanding being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. Who's controlling Galilee here at this time then? Herod Antipas. So he's going up to the territory of Herod Antipas, and that's the one with whom he has much to do. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, here's a little situation we need to deal with. Don't we have as an implication here that Joseph is a little surprised whenever he gets back to Judea and finds out who's in control, that it's Archelaus. He's just been warned of the angel in Egypt. to go back into the land because those who have sought the young child's life are now dead. He comes into the land of Israel, the end of verse 21. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, then he was afraid to go thither. It seems like the implication is he's a little bit surprised. He did not expect that whenever he was coming from Egypt up into the southern portion of Judea, up into Jerusalem. It's a little surprised. He did not expect to find Archelaus as leader here. Technically, there's a reason for this, and we need to explain this. Herod the Great had disinherited Archelaus for various and diverse reasons, and planned on Antipas taking control not only of Galilee and of Perea, but of Judea, Idumea, and Samaria as well. Joseph evidently knew of this arrangement. Remember, he goes down into Egypt before Herod ever dies. So we're talking about just a little prior to Herod's death, a year or so prior to Herod's death. He knows, he's privy to the information, and it probably just would have become common knowledge among the Jews. They can tell that Herod's becoming an old man here, and they kind of want to know who's going to reign after him, who's going to be in control after him. So it's just common knowledge that toward the end of Herod's life, Herod disinherited Archelaus, means struck him out of his will, and planned on putting Antipas in his place. Antipas would control both his territory and that of Archelaus. This is to show you how correct, again, the narrative is here. You just can hardly understand where liberals are coming from whenever you do a lot of study like we do, just week after week after week, and just give you one little tiny tidbit of information of a historical note of trustworthiness that's behind a particular verse here. Well, can't you see what's going on here then? Meanwhile, you see, whenever he leaves Palestine to go down to Egypt, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, the last thing he hears is that Archelaus has been disinherited. He's not going to control any territory. Therefore, whenever you come back to Israel, however many months or years later, whenever you come back to it later, if Archelaus is in control, you'd be surprised, because the last information you knew about Herod's will was that Archelaus had been taken out of it. However, while Joseph was down in Egypt, the very last weeks of Herod's life, he puts Archelaus back in his will to make him ruler of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Therefore, this is a surprise to Joseph. That's why we have verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign, we'd think, well, he would have known that all along. Not necessarily. Not if the will has been changed twice now toward the end of Herod's life. Then he would be a little surprised. And when he discovered this, that Archelaus did reign in Judea, he knew how ruthless he was. Notice what we have there in the middle of that verse. He was afraid to go thither. He knew how ruthless he was, because these boys, these sons, would have been minor rulers under Herod whenever Herod was still alive, Herod the Great. And as a result of him already knowing, he's kind of expecting Antipas to be ruler here. And Antipas was of a milder disposition and character than was Archelaus. And so God, by changing Herod's will and by getting the right son in the right place, is dictating where Jesus will be brought up then. I mean, this one thing dictates where he's going to be raised. And the Jews would think, and we might think, Jerusalem is the place for the Messiah to be born and to be brought up and to live and to everything. And not true at all. What would have brought him to Jerusalem and kept him there is that if Herod's will had remained intact as Joseph had thought it. Where Archelaus has been disinherited, Antipas is there. He's of a milder disposition and character. Of course, we know he has John the Baptist's head lopped off, but who instigates that, though? That's not his desire. He said it was sorry, but for the oath and for all the company there, he goes ahead and fulfills his word. It wasn't his character, not Herod Antipas. That is the character of Archelaus. So God has a man in here in Judea, in Jerusalem, like this Archelaus here, to get Joseph and the family to move from there, of course, up into Galilee, where he can be raised outside of the hustle and the bustle and all the religiosity that's going on down in Jerusalem. So he knows this. He knows the character of Archelaus. He's afraid to go thither. And so now that you're in Israel, you kind of pause, wondering what to do, and for about the fourth time in this chapter, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. He couldn't go to Samaria, probably for two reasons. One, he couldn't be raised among the Samaritans, and two, you're still in the same territory of Archelaus. You couldn't be raised in Idumea probably for two reasons, just the two that I just mentioned there. You have to go beyond that, and the closest thing beyond that's all the way up to Galilee. He came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene.